We shouldn't be surprised if whoever's Chancellor after the election, if perhaps they announce some tax rises that were not in the manifestos. At least that's what the history of previous post-election budgets tell us. We often see pretty chunky tax rises in the first year of a parliament, and I think it's fair to say lots of those tax rises were not in the winning party's manifestos.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the IFS Zooms In. I'm Bill Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and this is our third election special episode. And this episode we're going to tackle one or two of the difficult decisions facing the next government. We're going to look at the fiscal rules and promises. We might even mention that £2,000 number. Will Labour really be increasing taxes by that amount, or is that just a sideshow? We're also going to be looking at one particular area of policy and one of the public services which have been and will be impacted by the tight economic situation, and that is education, and in particular the school system. How's that fared over recent years? How are we doing in education? As ever, is there any money? So to do that, I'm joined by my two fantastic colleagues, Carl Emerson and Christine Farquharson. Let's start with the debate which Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer had on Tuesday evening. It was good to hear Julie Etchingham, who was running that debate, quote the IFS as saying that we were concerned that there was a bit of conspiracy of silence between the parties, and we'll come on to what that means in a minute. But let's start with the big row over the £2,000 tax increase that Rishi Sunak claimed that Labour were going to be introducing. And just to explain that £2,000 number, this is a number made up of a series of supposed commitments by Labour Party, which individual commitments were costed by people in the Treasury on the basis of assumptions imposed on them by the Conservatives, and then added up and used in a particular way by Rishi Sunak. I don't think we should take that number terribly seriously, but, and there is a big but here, I think we should take seriously the idea that taxes will rise after the election. And indeed, Carl, we know that taxes are going to rise, don't we? Because the government's already announced a great big tax rise, which the Labour Party appears to be agreeing with.
That's right. The plan is for pretty much every single threshold in the personal tax system to be frozen right the way through the next 3 years. Jeremy Hunt, the current Chancellor, has confirmed that he would do that and end the freeze in March 2028. So that means the point at which you start to pay income tax, the point at which you start to pay higher rate tax, the point at which you and your employer starts to pay national insurance contributions, alongside a whole load of other allowances all being frozen. And our estimate is that by the time that's over, that will raise an additional £11 billion. That's £11 billion a year on top of what's already been raised by freezing those thresholds in recent years. So a big tax rise coming under the Conservatives' plan. And as you say, Labour have not said anything about this, so one assumes that they would also be increasing taxes in this way.
And possibly other tax rises beyond that. I mean, we haven't had any promise. I mean, one or two little bits and pieces from Labour, but the fiscal situation, our situation with borrowing and spending, suggests to us that after the election, there might just be some more tax rises. Perhaps, Carl, you could just take us through why that might be. I should say we are not here advocating for higher tax rises. We are simply, as it were, doing the arithmetic, looking at what's planned for spending, looking at the rules the parties have imposed upon themselves in terms of the levels of borrowing and debt. And a conclusion that comes up is certainly that there is a significant risk that they'll need more tax increases even than that £11 billion.
Yeah, and it all stems from the weakness of the public finances and perhaps naively us taking very seriously the commitment that the Conservative government and the Labour opposition have made to have debt falling as a share of national income in the fifth year of the Parliament. So they said that they're committed to making that happen. Under the plans that we saw back in March alongside the budget, The letter of that rule was being kept to by the government, but only because of that big tax rise that's coming over the next few years. So fair enough, maybe that will happen. Plus penciling in some tight spending plans that, once you account for likely increases in spending on things like the NHS and defence, requires pretty deep cuts to unprotected public services and also cuts to investment spending. So one option would be to try and keep to those plans. You'd be needing to find 20, maybe 30 billion pounds a year of cuts in real terms from unprotected services. Really not easy to do. That would be cutting services that bore the brunt of the austerity of the 2010s. Another option to meet the target would be to push up taxes even further, and that's perhaps why we shouldn't be surprised if whoever's Chancellor after the election, if perhaps they announce some tax rises that were not in the manifestos. At least that's what the history of previous post-election budgets tell us. We often see pretty chunky tax rises in the first year of a parliament, and I think it's fair to say lots of those tax rises were not in the winning party's manifestos. That happened after the 92 election, after the 2010 election, and also after the 2001 election. So both sides have done that.
And that's what we mean when we have talked about a conspiracy of silence between the two parties, because, in a sense, for obvious reasons, neither of them want to discuss this. Neither of them want to tell us where any spending cuts might come from, nor do they want to tell us, if there are no spending cuts, what tax increases they might want to put in place, nor do they want to tell us, actually, what we've been telling you about our commitment to fiscal discipline isn't quite true. So we've not heard anything about any of that, and that's what we mean when we say that actually the two parties, in a very strange way, are conspiring with each other not to discuss this, and indeed to claim that this isn't a big issue. Whereas you can see, and this is a matter of simple arithmetic, you've got these three moving parts, and one of them has to give unless, and you've been writing about this, Carl, unless we get more growth than we're expecting. And I heard Keir Starmer on the radio last week saying that he held us in much esteem, but we got all of this wrong because he was going to get growth going, and if you get growth going, all will be well. What do you make of that?
Well, all the numbers I just talked through are based on forecasts, and to be honest, we know the forecasts will be wrong. They might turn out to be too optimistic. They might turn out to be too pessimistic. So it's possible the economy will grow more quickly over the next few years. We certainly must hope that will be the case. Now, why might it grow more quickly? Labour keeps pointing to the idea that we could make some policy changes, we could have a big focus on growth, and we could bring about stronger growth as a result of direct policy action. And over the longer term, I've got a lot of sympathy with that argument. If you get your policies right around competition, planning, immigration, trade, and education, as we're going to come on to talk about, you can make a difference to growth in a positive sense over the longer term. But I don't think there's much you can do that will move the dial, or anything you can do that will move the dial in a very convincing, immediate way that will be substantial. You're not going to come in and suddenly do things that are going to immediately boost the growth rate in a way that will convince the Office for Budget Responsibility and other forecasters that will definitely be the case. So you should do those reforms. There's a good case for them, but you'll reap the rewards over 5, 10 years and beyond. Now, of course, there's another possibility. We could get more growth because you get lucky. And we used to grow before the financial crisis at much stronger rates than what's expected over the next few years. And we should certainly hope that we get lucky and more growth materializes. But of course, hoping for more growth, hoping to get lucky is not a strategy. And while we might get lucky, we might get unlucky. And I think it's worth noting that the Office for Budget Responsibility's forecasts for growth are more optimistic than the Bank of England, more optimistic than most independent forecasters. And their record since 2010 is one where they've actually on average been more optimistic than what's actually turned out to be the case. So I would certainly advise both Jeremy Hunt and Rachel Reeves to be thinking about a plan for, well, what happens if growth disappoints? And I think ideally we would hear from them before the election about what they would do if some external shock comes along and the economy just ends up smaller than we expect it to be in the next few years.
And it doesn't even have to be much of an external shock, as you said. The Office of Budget Responsibility, they have been looking at the economy through somewhat rosy-tinted spectacles over the last few years, despite what you might hear from some politicians who are complaining that they're being too miserable about the world. They're actually among the most optimistic of the forecasters. And I think it really is, I think this is a really important point, it's incumbent on both parties to say, because there's probably at least a 50% chance of this, what would they do in an autumn budget or fiscal statement if, as is at least 50% probable, the Office of Budget Responsibility downgrades its forecast despite all of the wonderful policies that they might put in front of the OBR. Not because the OBR thinks those policies are going to damage the economy, just because the forecasts have changed. Actually, growth last year wasn't quite as good as the OBR thought it had been back in March. As you say, other forecasters are less optimistic. If the OBR moves towards the consensus, then we lose quite a lot of quotes headroom, unquotes, in the fiscal numbers, and then you're going to have to do something. And this shouldn't be, this is something to say, we will be very rude if the new government comes in and says, oh, look, this is a terrible shock. We've opened the books. The OBR have told us something we never expected. And that's why we didn't tell you about all these tax rises we're going to introduce, or that's why we didn't tell you we're going to have an entirely different set of fiscal rules, or that's why we didn't tell you about the skip spending cuts. I think that would be fundamentally dishonest of them, and that, Carl, I think is what you have demonstrated in the work you've just published, showing you very, very clearly that small changes to these growth numbers, which could well happen, blow a hole in all of these fiscal calculations.
And the effect on the fiscal numbers is big. On the upside, stronger growth, just 0.5% a year on growth could make a real difference. It could even end up in the kind of world where whoever's chancellor after the election gets to say, well, actually, I don't need to do any of these cuts to day-to-day spending on unprotected public services. Actually, I don't need to do this big rise in tax. I can still have debt falling because of that higher growth that I've got lucky with. But it goes both ways. And as you say, there's probably at least a 50% chance that there's going to be a downgrade to the growth forecast over the next few years. That could mean that if you were taking the debt target seriously, and I'm not recommending you take the debt target seriously, but that's what they tell us they want to do, you'd be needing to find another 20, 30 billion pounds a year to make that add up. And that won't be easy to find. And actually, if we end up in that world, I really wouldn't be surprised if the thing that gave would be that the debt target gets softened, gets pushed back, or changed in some other way.
Yeah, and it is worth saying that despite the miserable tone of my question, there is a chance that things will get better. I mean, maybe we will get back at some point. Maybe the next government will get lucky and growth will return to its pre-financial crisis levels, and that just does make things a great deal easier. And we really hope that happens, and please, listeners, believe that. It also means, of course, that all of our slightly miserable tone of what we've been saying over the last few weeks might look a bit wrong, but it's not wrong. It's just that given current forecasts and given the risks to those forecasts, it is, I think, as I said, incumbent on the parties to tell us how they would deal with bad luck, not just hope for good luck. This is very much a podcast of two parts. We've just had a fairly high-level discussion about the state of the public finances and the broad challenges that are going to face the next government. I'm now going to move on to talking to Christine about the particular issues around the education system and especially the school system. And Christine, along with some other colleagues, has been, as much of the IFS over the last couple of weeks, staggeringly productive. Two big reports, two really interesting reports come out in the last few days from Christine and colleagues. One looking at what's happened to spending on schools and things like teacher pay and so on over the last period, and challenges looking forward. And another looking at the performance of the school system and how well children within it have been doing, and what the impact of COVID on all of that has been. So let's dive into the first of those, Christine. The spending on schools and the pressures on spending in schools. What can you tell us about how that has changed, particularly since 2010 and over this Parliament?
Right. So you've said that this is a podcast of two parts. And when we look at school spending, what we're seeing is a fiscal picture of two parts. Between 2010 and 2019, schools saw really big cuts in per pupil spending, about 9% cut in per pupil spending in real terms. That's a huge squeeze. And then after 2019, the government essentially took a decision to try and make up for that history. So they raised school budgets by around $6 billion in real terms. That's brought per pupil spending roughly back to where it was in 2010. Now, that's still unusual. It's rare to go it's in fact unheard of to go a 14-year period with no growth in per pupil real term spending on schools. But the other interesting thing there is that really a sensible way to be designing schools' budgets? Do we really think that the optimal profile of school resources is to have this huge cut over a decade and then try and make up for lost ground 5 years later? It looks very odd. And where we are going forward, so at the moment, we've made up for that lost ground. We haven't really moved beyond that, but we've made it up. Going forward, we see that schools are facing higher levels of inflation than the rest of the economy. So schools' costs in the next year are probably going to grow about 4%. Economy-wide inflation maybe around 1%. And so even if you, on sort of public finance numbers, are being generous to schools and giving them increases in their budgets that meet inflation, actually once you take into account cost pressures, staff wages, energy costs, property costs, that starts to look a lot less generous, and schools are set to see their purchasing power fall even over the next couple of years.
And there were two or three elements of this story which were really striking, I think, in the work that you and colleagues have done. So the obviously the biggest element of schools' costs are pay, and teacher pay is obviously a really important part of that. And I was really struck not just by what's happened to teacher pay since 2010, but also how teacher pay has changed since the turn of the century relative to the pay in the rest of the economy.
Yeah, so this is astonishing. This is one of those reports where you look at that number and you just go, oh my God, is that right? Because what we've seen is that teachers have had no real terms pay growth since 2001. There's on average no pay rise for the average teacher over more than 2 decades. During that time, economy-wide earnings have grown by 18% in real terms. And so we've seen teachers essentially working hard, and we'll come on to just how hard they've been working and just how successful they've been, working really hard, but falling behind the average worker in the earnings distribution. And that cannot be unrelated to the pressures that we're seeing, the challenges we're facing in terms of recruiting teachers, retaining teachers. 1 in 10 teachers leaves the state sector every year. And some of the challenges, particularly in those specialist subjects like math or physics, where we've seen, for example, the Labour Party say, "Oh, we're gonna recruit an extra 6,500 teachers." Well, that's great. We'd love to. Where are you going to find those people if you're not going to give them a real terms pay rise in over 20 years?
And it's amazing the system hasn't collapsed, actually. I mean, in a sense, the rate of teachers leaving the profession hasn't increased dramatically over that period, has it? And I'm always kind of puzzled by how we continually fail to meet the targets for recruiting teachers, and yet schools still keep operating.
Yeah, this is interesting. I think part of this is filling the gaps with other staff. So we have people like teaching assistants who are coming in. Teaching assistant numbers have gone up a lot over this period. Obviously, that's not taking on necessarily some of the teaching tasks, but there might be other tasks that teachers would have done in the past that teaching assistants are able to support with. But, teaching assistants have their own job to do as well. Another finding from this report is we've seen the number of children with kind of receiving the highest levels of support for special educational needs. That's gone up by 60%. And a lot of that support is being provided by teaching assistants. So it's not that we have this untapped pool of resource within schools and a bunch of people sitting around twiddling their thumbs. They really are doing an awful lot to keep the show on the road.
Yeah, and from recollection, actually, in terms of where the problems are filling the specialist posts that you were talking about in maths and physics and so on, it's often in the less affluent schools, particularly actually outside of London and the southeast. So in exactly those areas of the country which we worry about in terms of levelling up are the places you are least likely to have properly qualified teachers in some of those specific subjects.
Absolutely, and that's a huge challenge because time and time and time again, when you look at what makes the difference for children's educational attainment, the thing that makes the difference is having a great teacher in the front of the class. That matters far more than how many kids you have sitting in the seats. That matters far more than a lot of the other things that could happen that, breakfast clubs or free lunches or whatever. The most important thing in the education system is getting good teachers and holding on to them once you have them.
And that will probably come as a surprise to nobody, but actually you wouldn't believe it from some of the things that we hear from politicians. Now, you've touched on another thing which really struck me from that report, which is the extraordinary increase in the number of children with diagnosed or designated to having the highest levels of educational needs. And in particular, you talked about an increase in spending on schools over the last few years. An extraordinary fraction of that has just gone on these increased number of kids with these high needs. Half of the increase has gone on this relatively small group, but very fast-growing group with very high needs.
Absolutely, and this is a story that we're seeing again and again. We're seeing it in local government as well, where you have an increase in very high levels of needs. Those are expensive to provide for. Providing for those children on a per child basis, that's getting more expensive over time as well. And once you combine those two things together, there really just is not a lot of scope to do anything else. We see that in the health service when we talk about trying to shift budgets from acute care into preventative care. We see that in crime when we talk about trying to support young people before they start offending rather than trying to deal with it after they've done something. And we're seeing that now in the school system as well. These high needs, high cost services are a real challenge across all of the areas of public service.
And the third thing, again, I found very striking from this is looking forward a bit, which is that we're not having any children anymore. And actually the number of kids in schools is going to fall over the next few years. Now, to what extent is that offering an opportunity in the sense that if there are fewer kids, we might need fewer schools and fewer teachers and less money? And to what extent is a challenge in the sense that might mean we need to close schools, something which is never terribly popular in a local area, even if there are many fewer children around?
Yeah, so I think it's both of those things, which is why I think I would call it a choice. We have a choice. We're going to see pupil numbers fall by about 5% in the next few years, and we have a choice about what we do about that. You could choose to say we're going to keep per pupil spending fixed, and that's going to mean that the total school's budget falls. That's attractive, that saves some money, that frees up some cash that can go on other public services. Or you could say, well, actually, if you look at the costs that schools are facing, a lot of those are fixed in the short term. You might be able to have one or two fewer children in that class, but you still need a teacher at the front of the room to teach it. You might be able to free up a whole room in the school, but how are you actually going to be able to use that productively short of closing the school altogether or consolidating with somebody else? And those options, those closures, reducing staffing, all of those are genuine options on the table, but they're not easy and they're not necessarily short-term fixes. And so I think in the immediate term, in the next couple of years, the question is going to be, well, where are we trying to get in the slightly longer run? Which of those two routes are we going to take? But not necessarily, oh, great, the next government can make a snap decision and free up another $3.5 billion.
So yet another choice for the new government, and a big and difficult one. So we've talked a bit about the spending and teachers' pay and numbers of kids. Let's come on to the good news. Yeah. So you said we were going to come on to this in terms of how well effectively teachers have worked over the last period. I should warn listeners in Scotland and Wales, they might want to turn away at this point, because we're really talking about good news in England. We're not really talking about good news in the rest of the United Kingdom. But the good news here is actually things on most metrics in terms of how well English kids have done in international comparisons and so on. It's been quite a good period.
Yeah, so you spent a lot of time in the first half of this podcast telling us how miserable everything was. So this is going to be The Economist's attempt at optimism.
Yay.
So in England, we have this context where school spending has been squeezed. And yet, despite that, when we look at international tests, so the OECD runs these tests of 15-year-olds, literacy, numeracy, science, particularly the first two of those, English kids have been improving their performance quite a lot. And that's not the same story that you see when you look at the developed nations, particularly Scotland, where scores have really fallen back quite a lot. Now, PISA is a really important source for this, because we can look at skills, not necessarily at qualifications. So we can step outside this question of are the exams being dumbed down? We're really trying to understand skills. And when we look at that, that is a really genuine good news story that speaks to the productivity of the school system, because with fewer resources, with the squeeze on resources, we're actually getting to better outcomes. That's testament to hard work by teachers, by schools, and by national policymakers as well. The pandemic has cast a bit of a shadow over that. So the pandemic wiped out around a decade's worth of progress in reading. English school children fell back quite a lot between 2018 and 2022. But even there, that decline in England has actually been less pronounced than it has been in the rest of the UK, or indeed in many international comparisons as well. And so there are genuine challenges here around lost learning and around how we recover from that. But those are challenges that are shared internationally, and actually the English system has survived relatively well compared to others.
Just give us a sense of quite how bad the Welsh and Scottish systems look like by comparison.
Well, okay, the good thing you can say about the Welsh system internationally is that Wales has the most equal scores in the OECD.
This is equally bad, though, isn't it?
This is very much the definition of levelling down. So this is particularly more affluent pupils in Wales are just really not achieving in the way that they would be in the rest of the UK, or indeed in the rest of the OECD. And that's a real issue. That's a real challenge for that school system, because if you're not building up those core skills, literacy and numeracy amongst 15-year-olds, if you're not achieving that, you're going to really struggle with higher education, vocational education, skills, economic growth down the line.
So some good news on sort of test scores and so on in England, some less good news in Scotland and Wales, and some backward movement since the COVID pandemic, but actually less backward movement than a lot of other countries. But let's focus a bit now on what's happened since 2020, since 2021. We've had that period of things going really quite well, but we've had some really quite worrying longer term impacts, haven't we, or apparent impacts of what's happened since the lockdowns and the period when lots of children weren't going to school because they weren't allowed to go to school. So the thing that really, again, struck me was this extraordinary increase in the number of kids who are just not turning up to school regularly.
Yeah, and this is a huge issue. It's not an unknown issue, so people are talking about this, but absences and young people's mental health is got to be top of the agenda for the school system in the next parliament, because it is extraordinary, the hangover that we have from the pandemic. Before the pandemic, amongst disadvantaged people, so kids on free school meals, around 25% were persistently absent. That means that they were missing at least a day of school per fortnight on average. That is a really big number, even just on its own merits. 1 in 4 disadvantaged kids not turning up once a fortnight. But since the pandemic, that's risen to 37%. So we're now knocking on 4 in 10 disadvantaged kids persistently absent. If those kids aren't coming to school, all of the rest of your education policy basically doesn't matter. You can make your curriculum as great as you want it to be. You can have the best teacher at the front of the room. You can put in place free school meals or breakfast clubs or other policies that are going to support that child. But if they're not coming to the building to be able to access those services, you're kind of stuck in terms of what you're able to do to help.
And I mean, that's part of a story, isn't it, of increasing inequalities. I mean, we know that outcomes in the school system are very divided by social background, but there were at least very small and gradual improvements in that over the decade up to the pandemic. But that's widened out again.
Yeah, so this gets quite technical in terms of which particular dimensions you're looking at. If you're looking at persistent absence, actually the levels are much lower amongst children from less disadvantaged backgrounds, but the rate of increase since the pandemic is bigger. That rate has doubled since the pandemic, so it's gone from 8% to 16% for children not eligible for free school meals. But if you're looking at attainment, you're right, Paul, that what we've seen is basically blink and you'll miss it improvements in the disadvantage gap over the last 20, 25 years. And the pandemic has come in and, if anything, has made those gaps slightly wider again. And so there are these challenges about how you take a system where children missed almost 6 months of school, of in-person schooling in total, just from national lockdowns. We know that the most disadvantaged had the least access to virtual lessons, the least access to quiet study space, and spent the least time studying and working on schoolwork at home. So that is going to have an impact down the line. And it's another challenge for the school system to start to think about how they're going to recover from that.
And impacts on mental health as well.
Huge impacts on mental health. So this was, I think for me, one of those reports where every time I made a chart, I looked at my computer screen and just went, oh my God, and my team would come and gather around and we'd all look at it together on the screen. But when we look at when we look at young people's mental health, we now have 30% of girls aged 10 to 15 who have abnormally high scores on emotional and behavioral difficulties. That's a bit of a technical term, but essentially it means that the rates of mental health issues, particularly amongst adolescent girls, have skyrocketed since the pandemic. That 30%, that's up 5 percentage points since before the pandemic. And you see that particularly when you look at what young people say about their experiences of schools. So we played Guess the Number and we got wildly different numbers. Some people thought, everybody hated school. Some people thought nobody did. Before the pandemic, around 5% of kids, of adolescents, said that they basically strongly disliked their school. That's doubled to 10% now. Now, you might look at that and say that's still small potatoes, small numbers. But if you've got 10% of kids really viscerally not enjoying their schooling experience, and that's increased so much, that's got to feed into these challenges we're having with absence, and that's got to feed into the challenges that schools are reporting with behavior and with being able to manage classrooms as well.
And I think coming back to the first half of this podcast about the challenges facing a new government, I don't know about you, but I haven't forgotten the pandemic, but on the whole, it's weird. It's kind of right back in the sort of back end of my memory as a sort of bad dream in a sense, and life is back to how it was. But actually, it's had really big impacts on some people. These young people particularly. You can see it actually in other parts. We've seen this huge increase in the number of people claiming disability benefits, for example. We've had a big drop, not replicated internationally, actually, in the number of people in work, or the fraction of the population in employment. It's clearly one of the things that's created all the fiscal and economic problems that Carl was talking about earlier. But I agree with you. I think the biggest challenge that this has created is for this generation of young people, their impacts on their mental health, the impacts on their school attendance, the impacts on educational inequalities, which it's kind of easy as a sort of, an adult in sitting in a reasonably comfortable job and so on, just to forget that the world has changed and it's created all of these challenges.
Huge numbers of challenges. One of the things I always say to people is we talk a lot about education inequalities, and we always talk about what can schools do to fix those. And that's partly, I think, because of these numbers I've set out. Schools' budgets have been relatively well protected compared to a lot of other areas of public service. But there's this real focus on schools as the problem solvers and schools as the service providers. Educational inequalities start way before school, and they're affected by things that happen way beyond the school gate too. So housing crises, income shocks, the cost of living crisis, the lack of mental health support and challenges in the health service, all of those things are having impacts on children, and all of that is feeding into the challenges that we're going to have recovering from what was a very big shock for an awful lot of young people. And they're now trying to adjust, in some cases, to a world that they really didn't know a lot about before the pandemic came and disrupted the whole thing.
And I can recommend to anyone listening to read a lot of the things that Christine and her colleagues have written, not just over the last couple of weeks, but over the last few years, both on educational inequalities and what drives them. Fantastic thing as part of our Deaton review of inequalities, really the go-to piece of work to describe and understand inequalities in outcomes, as you say, starting in the early years and pushing right through. Work Christine and colleagues have also done on Sure Start and actually how effective that was at reducing some of these inequalities. But of course, it's since been funding has been cut so significantly. And then what's happened since COVID. So please do go to our website and look at that, and indeed some of our previous podcasts and clips and so on, where we've examined this kind of issue. We have covered some fantastic ground here. Thank you so much to Christine for that wonderful some good news there, some positive news, but some worries for the future.
This is the economist version of optimism, Paul.
It's the best we can do. And I think the resoundingly non-optimistic view from Carl about the public finances, but we do live in hope. Economies change. I mean, who knew 4 years ago that interest rates would be so much higher than they were for the previous 12 years? Who knew in 2007 that we get growth so much lower than it had been for the last 40 years? So maybe growth will pick up, and let's hope to goodness it does. And if that's the case, whoever's in office will gain the benefits of that. But I think, as we've made abundantly clear, they shouldn't assume that will happen, and we really do want them to tell us what they're going to do about that. We'd also like them to tell us a bit more about what they're going to do about some of these challenges facing the education system. So thank you again for listening to this special election episode of the IFS Zooms In. We have been producing ridiculous amounts of work over the last few weeks, and will continue to produce lots of work. And we are doing a really good job, I promise you, of making this short, sharp, some lovely charts, nice and easy to look at. So please do visit our work at www.ifs.org.uk to look at everything that we're doing. And do remember, please, we really do appreciate your support, because this kind of quick reactive work is significantly, at least, funded by membership and by donations. So please do consider becoming a member of the IFS for as little as just £10 a month. You can find out more in the episode description. We'll see you next time.